Hey, what's good, y'all? Thanks for hopping in the car with Christian Addiction Recovery. I'm gonna get right into it today. No disclaimers, no intro. So, here by request is suffering. I know that you've just been waiting on the edge of your seat for that. This is my perspective on how God taught Job to go from his suffering into what God had for him, which was a double portion blessing. And where I got some of my inspiration for today's video was from a message by John Phillips, and I'll leave a link in the description down below. And he has some pretty nice insight into this story. So I'm going to keep this real brief. I'm not going to go to the scriptures because it would take a lot of time, but I'm going to put the scriptures right here while I'm going through the message. So if you want to, you can jot them down and then go check out the story for yourself, which I always highly recommend. Don't take my word for it, just like reading Rainbow. All right, so the 2022 breakdown version of this is that Job was a righteous man and he was highly blessed in the land. And Satan popped up in front of God one day. And God was like, "Where you come from?" And Satan was like, "I've just been walking around, checking out everything, seeing how things operate." And God's like, "Hey, you seen Job? He's pretty righteous." And Satan's like, "Of course Job is righteous and he's going to bless your name. Look at all the things that you've blessed him with." And he says, "I bet if you let me take some of that stuff from him and you release that hedge of protection around him, I bet I can get him to curse your name." And God's like, "That ain't gonna happen. I know Job. I know what he's got, and he has me." And you might say, "Well, why did God let Satan go put Job through this suffering and try to get him to curse his name?" And I believe it's so that we could learn from Job. That's kind of how I was saying is about the suffering. Sometimes your suffering can be just so other people can see how you handle your suffering, and God can do something through that. Job is a great example, and Paul is also a great example. And God's like, "Go for it. It ain't going to happen." So almost immediately, Job's servants started coming to him with the problems and the news that his wealth was being taken from him. The first one was his 500 cows and his 500 donkeys. You might say, "Well, that's a lot of donkeys." Well, they were like cars, that's what people rode around. So the first guy tells him that your 500 cows and your 500 donkeys have been stolen. And he's like, "Oh, well, I'm just going to go to the drawing board and mark some things off and do some accounting or whatever." And then almost immediately after that, another servant came to him and said, "There's lightning strike and it started a fire and all 7,000 of your sheep have been burnt up." And you might say that's a lot of sheep. And it was a lot of sheep. Sheep were used for clothes, eating, all types of things. The sheep was like having a Walmart. And then immediately after, before the other servant had even left, he's getting the news about the next thing. And that's his 3,000 camels. And you might say that's a lot of camels. Well, camels were used to transport things. So that was like having 3,000 big trucks out on the road taking things different places and gaining money off of that. But the guy comes up and says, "All your camels have been raided, your servants have been killed, and I'm the only one that made it out alive just so that I could tell you what happened." And so Job's like, "Well, that was everything. I had the camels, now I don't have the camels." But he's like, "You know what? It's just stuff. I came in this world naked. I'm going to leave in this world naked. So it might frustrate me a little bit, but I'm going to keep moving." And you might say, "Well, Job is handling this really well." And you would be right. But remember, he was the most righteous person in the entire land. So he has the utmost integrity out of anybody in existence at the time. And so next, this is the worst news. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and they were all at the oldest brother's house. And it says that a wind came from the wilderness to destroy the house. So probably like a tornado or something came through and just killed every single person. And so that servant comes up and breaks the news that his children are now dead. And of course, this one gets him. I mean, he's really suffering now. Suffering some loss of assets, that's one thing. But when you start suffering the loss of family, that's a totally different thing. And could you imagine having all 10 of your children killed at once? So Job was still standing in righteousness and integrity. Now, Satan goes back to God and said, God's like, "Where'd you come from?" He's like, "I've been looking around the earth. I've been seeing how things operate." And God's like, "Well, you notice Job? He's crushing it. He's crushing it." And Satan's like, "Well, of course he's crushing it. He still has his health." And God says, "Well, okay, well, you can harm his health, but you can't kill him." And so immediately after that, Job catches boils all over his body. And they're bad boils. And he's having physicians come to check him out. Everybody is telling him, "I don't know what it is, man. You got some stuff." And he's like, "What do I do?" And it's just like, tolerate it. And now he's suffering the loss of his assets, the loss of his children. He's now suffering in physical pain. And I think that anybody who's dealt with some serious suffering, those are pretty much the 3 subjects that most things fall under that bring great suffering. And so Job's wife comes to him and she's like, Why don't you just curse God and die? Isn't that crazy that she said the same thing to him that the devil told God that he was going to get her to do? And I just thought about this when I was reading the chapter. God didn't tell Satan that he couldn't harm Job's wife, but Satan never harms Job's wife. And it makes me wonder if he wanted a man behind enemy lines, if that makes any sense. I'll just leave that one right there. Put a pin in it. Think about it on your own time. But Job is standing in integrity and he just tells her to shut up. She doesn't know what she's talking about. All right. We get blessed and those things get taken away, and we're going to praise God no matter where we're at. That was his attitude. Obviously, she didn't have the same kind of relationship with God, and that's why he told her, get in your place. Now, this is where things start getting kind of rough for Job, okay? His friends come to visit. There's 3 friends, and almost immediately he starts complaining to his friends. Not that he doesn't have anything to complain about. I mean, he has suffered the worst circumstances that you could imagine, back to back to back. All of those things happened within the first chapter, within the first 20 verses. So literally verse after verse was just trial and tribulation. So if anybody's got something to complain about, Job does. But his friends get there, and so he starts complaining and just say, I wish you could erase the day I was born, and I wish my mother would have never had me, and all of these things. And his friends are no help. These are supposed to be 3 friends of faith, but all they can do is tell Job that he must be experiencing what he's experiencing because he was sinful along the way. That was their advice. And this goes on for literally like 30 chapters, guys. 35 chapters. Him going back and forth with his friends. And you'll just notice throughout the conversation, his complaining gets progressively worse. And by the time the end of it, he's to a place where he's blaming God. And he's starting to blame God and say, why can't you just be more like me? Why? Look at all these kind things I did for people. Look how I took care of the people that you sent me. And then this is how you treat me. And so the whole 35 chapters, it's progressing from complaining to blaming God. And now he's blaming God. You're so mean. Look at you. And that's when God steps in and he's like, hold up. Hold up. And then he starts asking Job. He says, hey, you better be ready. I'm going to ask you some big boy questions, and I want you to brace for them because it's going to shake you to your core. And then he starts questioning him for 4 chapters. Questions like, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? You see those stars up there? Are you the one that banded them together so that they hold their constellation? And look at the eagle. Can you make the eagle fly? And there's so many, guys. Look at the clouds. Can you design them the way that I designed them? And there's a couple times throughout the passage where Job kind of almost steps in and says, God, okay, I get it. I've said too much. Forgive me. And God's like, no. You've been complaining and blaming with your friends for 35 chapters. I can get about 35 verses in here. And so anyway, by the end of it, Job is saying, God, you are so great. He's back to saying, God, you are so great. And so he was able to press through and continue to have that integrity and that righteousness that he strives for, even in the midst of some of the greatest sufferings ever experienced by man. And so by praising God in his suffering, God was able to break Job out of that curse that imprisoned him. But this is where God was able to bless Job twice what he had before. And that's when he decided, I'm going to go ahead and pray for my friends, even though they're buttheads. And they came over here and they're just straight, almost dragged me to hell with them. I'm going to pray for them. And I'm just going to pray blessings on them. And that's when in the Bible it says that God blessed Job with double everything he had. Where he had 500 cows, now he had 1,000 cows. Where he had 500 donkeys, now he has 1,000 donkeys. Where he had 7,000 sheep, he had 14,000 sheep. When he had 3,000 camels, now he has 6,000 camels. But he had 7 sons and 3 daughters before, and God gave him 7 sons and 3 daughters after. Now, the cool thing is that God is showing him that you didn't lose your children. Your children are with me in heaven. So I've given you 7 more sons and 3 more daughters, but you really have 14 sons now and 6 daughters. And I thought that was a really cool point out of this story, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about, how are you in your suffering? Are you complaining? Are you blaming? Here's the thing, we're all going to have sufferings. And that's one thing that I feel like I was kind of lied to growing up in our culture. I feel like our culture has taught us that life is easy. And when it turns out to not be easy, which it's not, we start blaming other people and we start complaining about our circumstances. And that takes us from an attitude of acceptance. And the enemy knows that as Christians, the more that we can live in a place of acceptance to God's rearing us and steering us in the right direction, that God can use us to literally take down the kingdom of darkness. And so he doesn't want that. And so he tries to attack us and he tries to put us through things that makes us suffer. And like I said, we're all going to suffer, but it's what you're doing in that suffering that is either imprisoning you by that suffering or allowing you to break through to a new freedom because of that suffering. And I was talking about in the last video that I consider the suffering that God is telling us to do in the New Testament is to deal with the things that make us uncomfortable and tolerate things that he's putting us through and understand that they play a part of a bigger plan. Like Job, for instance, there was barely books back then. So he had no idea that for 4,000 years, people were going to be reading about his sufferings, learning about how to not complain and how to praise God in the middle of the suffering. All right, guys, that wraps it up. Hey, go ahead and smash that like for me real quick. Or if you didn't like it, hit that dislike. That way I know that you don't like suffering. Right, but it's all good. I understand. It's not a topic that we all like hearing about, especially when I'm telling you that you got to deal with it. Hey, and if you went ahead and stayed till the end of the video, go ahead and comment "deal with it" down there so I know that you heard the whole story. All right. Also, comment below. Tell me anything that you might need prayer for or a friend needs prayer for or anything like that. Anything that I see in the comments, I'm going to pray about it and I'm going to ask other people to pray about it. Okay? I hope I helped open your eyes about suffering a little bit today. Definitely go check out my other video that I put a link to down there on suffering. And make sure you check out John Phillips' video that I put a link to in the description as well. He gives the story with a lot more class than I do. And if you haven't yet, hit that red button right down there. It says subscribe. Click it one time for me. I'm a new channel. I'm not going to be popping up in your suggested videos again unless you like, subscribe, or comment. And so this is how we do it over here. I do the videos. You guys do the clicks. Then we meet in the middle. All right, y'all. Peace.